should be broadcasting now. Our slideshow is being a bit of a nightmare today, but hello everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, shall we start?
Yes, I think so. I think that should be everyone in now. Hello everybody.
Hi.
Okay, shall we start? Great. Welcome everyone to our talk. We going to talk about, I don't know whether this is the right time, whether you had lunch already or you're preparing lunch afterwards, but I hope our talk kind of inspires you in either way. So we are going to talk about foods and words and how our appetite, our love for food can also motivate our love for language. And we, three of us based in Oxford, and my name is Jieun Kiaer, and I'm a professor in Korean linguistics in Oxford University. And Laurence, can you?
Hello, my name is Laurence Mann, and I'm also at Oxford teaching alongside Jieun, but I teach Japanese.
And Niamh?
I'm Niamh Calway. I just finished my Master's of Studies in Korean at Oxford University, and I'm hoping to go on to my PhD in Oriental Studies, focusing on East Asian cookbook manuscripts next year.
Great. So we all based in Oxford. We all love languages. As you can see that I'm sort of specialized in Korean language, and Laurence Japanese, and Niamh Korean and Chinese. But we also really love to talk about food. And this talk is grown up from our love for food and language. So I hope you really enjoy our talk. Yeah, and Laurence will introduce, will give you introduction about this talk. Laurence.
Okay, hello everyone. Really nice to, well, see, I can't actually see you, but I can see all your lovely chats popping up at my box at the bottom of the screen. Just to say also, please use the Q&A function, because we will, coming to that at the end, we will use it. So please do ask as many questions as you like. I just really want to make a quick introduction by talking about why the three of us have come together to look at this topic. I'll start by saying that I think we'll all agree that food is a nexus of culture and language. It is a focal point at which we see forces underpinning language and communication coming together. Again, I think we would all agree that food at once encompasses the universality of human cultures, and at the same time, the almost infinite variety and diversity of those cultures. And it's actually not just the kind of the variety and the diversity that we're interested in, but also that how that motivates us to think about food and think about language. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that, because human beings love to talk about food so much that it actually has substantial impact on how we speak and how we communicate, and that's what we're interested in. So could I have the next slide, please? As a team, Jieun, Niamh and I are working to promote and celebrate linguistic and cultural diversity in the United Kingdom through the looking glass of the languages of food and drink in the English language, but particularly those with diverse and external heritages. This is kind of really our overall project, but another element of that is that we want to try to show that all this interest is a great way of motivating us. Our interest in food, our conversations about food can really be a motivating factor for anyone trying to learn a foreign language. So that's what our talk is really about today. Also, we will introduce some lovely, tasty examples of food words that we're going to be using in our forthcoming book to stimulate language learning and the motivation for language learning. We're also going to stress the fascinating hybridity of food words and show the global heritage of those words, which can be the key starting point for developing linguistic discussions that not only help us to understand how words move around the world, but also spur us on to learn the new languages. Next slide, please. Thank you. On this slide, we can see roughly how the order will go. I'm going to just, as I've already said, really offer a snippet of the rationale and the theoretical underpinnings for our project very briefly. And then I'm going to hand you over to Niamh, and then later Jieun, who's going to take you through the tasty part, some of the fascinating, delicious foods and drinks that we're discussing in our book. Next slide, please. I think what's really important to us is that at a time like now, where international travel is being curtailed obviously by the health crisis, we're also seeing a huge interest in food. It's really an explosion of interest in food around the world. People seem to be using their time spent physically away from others to cook, to hone their culinary skills, and also to experiment with new cuisines. Crucially, though, they're also talking about food, particularly through social media. And in the process, they're fostering bonds of community, of friendship, even some cases of healing, really, of therapy. And in fact, even before the pandemic started, there was really an ever deepening ocean of blogs and other multimodal online resources dedicated to cooking, eating, and talking about cooking and eating. So I think we'd all agree that we are living through an exceptionally productive period, both for food and for language. Next slide, please. As we aim to show you today, the enjoyment of eating and discussing food is a strong motivating factor for learning words. This is true for L1 learners, first language learners who are acquiring the knowledge of their first words in their first language. But it can also be true for L2 learners who are trying to get to grips with an additional language somewhat later in life. Many authors in discussions going all the way back to the 1970s, as you can see, there's one example on the slide, they recognize that motivation is the major factor in student attainment when learning an additional language. And indeed, some authors actually argue that that is the main factor that positively influences student achievement in language learning. So certainly the main reason that Jieun, Niamh, and I got together to make the project on food and language was really to think about ways to mobilize this strong motivational dimension of food for teaching and learning languages. And as Jieun has already alluded to, another reason was because the three of us all enjoy drooling over lovely pictures of delicious dishes from around the world. Next slide, please. Briefly, I would like to introduce just one piece of relevant theoretical background related to how we are conceiving of communication and the motivations for language learning. In general, we are deconstructing the strict distinctions, as you can see on the slide, between native speakers and non-native speakers, or speakers of foreign languages, also between our words and their words, words in our language, words in their language, and between a native vocabulary stratum and borrowings, as they're often called. These distinctions certainly have their place in some areas of linguistics. We're not trying to get rid of them altogether, but we just don't feel that they are very useful in our current discussion. The situation is certainly more complex than that. Although we often like to try to draw strict divisions between one set of words in a language and another, if we are too rigid in our description of the origins and parameters of words and meaning, and in this case, the origin and meaning of food words, this can lead to confusion and lack of understanding, as indeed culturally exclusive language can in general for minority groups and identities. Our work on food words has really tended to support an individualized or idiolect-centered approach to understanding how we communicate. This means that the words we choose when we communicate are affected not only by our native language environment, but also by our own personal backgrounds and experiences, which you might like to call our life stories. Importantly, also, our emotions and attitudinal responses are involved, and also how we perceive those responses of others, so the affective and emotional legacy, really, of our words on other people. Kiaer and Mann 2019 introduced a so-called 3 E's model to explain how speaker motivation influences communication, as you can see on this slide. Efficiency, here at the top of the slide, very simply relates to the easiest way to make yourself understood through your words. We often see examples of the role of efficiency in word choice among our students of Korean and Japanese at Oxford. And I'm sure that many of you will almost certainly have had this same experience. There are some words that our students find easier to communicate to their classmates in the languages that they study rather than, say, English or perhaps their native languages. And this is really because they know that fellow students and classmates have shared experiences with them, perhaps on a year abroad, perhaps just studying Korean, Japanese, Chinese in the classroom with us. And this means that it can be more efficient for them to use a Korean word when discussing a particular topic, or a Chinese word, Japanese word. That's a very simple idea. The second E, expressivity, has to do with the attitudinal and effective responses to words by a speaker. Words in this case are chosen according to how meaningful or relevant to a particular cultural context that they are felt to be by a speaker. This is also affected by a variety of internal and external factors and a particular cultural context and external setting in which a speech or a conversation is taking place. The last E, empathy, relates to solidarity building through word choice. Words, as we all know, can remind people of cultural settings, community and kinship ties, and invoking them brings about an emotional response in the listener. In many cases, in the case of food, it's a positive emotional response. Due to this link with emotion, this of course is also used, is really central to many word choices in commercial contexts, such as advertising. So thinking about food words again, if we take these words that originate in another cultural linguistic setting, but are kept alive through these quite complex processes of word choice within, for example, diasporic communities of speakers, or just within communities of people talking about food because they love it so much, it is actually very difficult to write off words with external heritages as mere borrowings, because they are more than that. Next slide, please. Jieun and Niamh will both share more examples, really tasty examples with you shortly. Again, I'm sure that many of you listening will have had your own experiences to bring to the discussion. But I think I feel very strongly that knowledge of one particular kind of food or drink associated with a language or cultural tradition is very often the start of a sort of usually quite simple conversation to begin with, that can lead very quickly onto a sophisticated joined-up learning experience for learners of languages. I think this really hints at the role of food as a significant motivating factor in language learning settings. As you can see on the slide, you start with a learner-generated discussion, and then through a little bit of teacher input, this can really blossom into something else. Just to give you one example, I know Niamh is going to talk about tea later on, but I often talk to students of Japanese and also people who are just interested in Japanese but are not actively studying it in a formal setting, who are really into drinking matcha or some other kind of matcha-derived drinks, such as matcha latte. As you all know, these drinks are now hugely popular around the world, very widespread popularity. This is partly due to globalization of latte in general, espresso-based latte through West Coast of America coffee culture, and also partly through this social media-driven consumption and discussion of East Asian food and drink within popular culture, such as K-dramas and J-pop. In one case, quite recently, when I was talking to such a person, the discussion started at the level of the learner's lived experience, just something as simple as, I really love matcha. I like making matcha-based desserts. I love matcha ice cream. But quickly it moved on to very technical and linguistically advanced discussion of the taxonomies of tea in the Japanese language. So we talked about, different grades of leaf tea, such as banchan, sencha, gyokuro. We also then talked about differences of extraction processes and cultivation. So it really turned into a very natural and valuable learning experience. So I want you to all to bear this in mind as I pass you over now to Niamh and then to Jieun, to discuss some more in-depth examples of the food words that can help us to learn languages. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Laurence, for that excellent introduction. My section now, we're going to give you, I'm going to run you through 4 case studies, very quick kind of whistle-stop tour, because I'm aware that we don't have a huge amount of time and I want some time for your questions, because I see the Q&A box filling up wonderfully there. I'm going to run you through some ideas that we are writing about in our upcoming book, which is sort of just examples of how food words, as Laurence said, how food words don't end up belonging to one culture. They're not just borrowed into different cultures, but they really are globalized terms. And these are some stories and some histories of how words sort of, gain camouflage, chameleon-like movement through cultures and really become parts of a globalized vocabulary through our appetite and through food. So our first topic is dumplings. So talking about, oh no, we don't want that. Talking about what is a dumpling. So the OED definition of a dumpling is a kind of pudding consisting of a mass of paste or dough, more or less globular in form, either plain or boiled or enclosing fruit and boiled or baked, and is originally attributed to Norfolk, England, dating to around 1600. So we see the original kind of dumpling is a traditional sort of British dumpling, usually made of suet, floated in top of a stew or a soup. Now this, again, is what the OED definition reflects, the idea of a Norfolk dumpling. Whereas now today, when a lot of people think of the word dumpling, they think of Asian food, they think of bao, they think of jiaozi in Chinese, they think of gyoza in Japanese, they think of mandu in Korean, maybe even Tibetan momo, all kinds, but generally East and Southeast Asian kinds of dumplings. So we can see a really good example of this is Googling the word dumpling. And obviously this is from my UK IP address, so this is a UK kind of specific result. But I did this on Thursday and I Googled dumpling, and these are the first 4 pages that come up. As we see, the bottom right middle down there, there's one picture of, a British style stew and suet dumplings, but the rest pretty much are East Asian kinds of dumplings, all different kinds, but all based in East Asia. And so this is really interesting to see that the word dumpling has changed completely in terms of what we think of it and to what culture we think it belongs. Now, Jieun and I engaged in research in 2018 on English speakers' perceptions of words and food words, where they come from and to what heritage we think they belong. Now, this study consisted of just over 200 people, and it was a survey distributed online. We had responses from mostly native English language speakers, 60% considered themselves natives, but 40% considered themselves second language. The majority of the English spoken was British English, but we also had about 30% American and Australian English. Now, this is the response to the question, to which language or culture do you think the term dumpling belongs? As we see here, 63.9, nearly 64% of people thought that Chinese was one of the languages or cultures that they thought dumpling belonged to. There were plenty of people that only responded with Chinese. And this is really interesting to see, that a word that's been part of the English language for hundreds of years, was considered quite a traditional item, has come to be thought of as primarily Chinese, and then equally Pan-Asian and British English. We see 31.3% have chosen those 2 answers, closely followed by Japanese and then Korean. So we see it's very interesting that this meaning has completely changed, and this is how people think of it now. Again, we asked, where is the word dumpling from? And we looked here, which images here do you associate the most with the word dumpling? Now, this option 1 up here on the top left are Chinese bao style dumplings, and that took 40% of the vote. 40% of people thought that that's what the dumplings were. And then we saw the next highest was option 4, which is the one just underneath it, which is a fried Japanese gyoza. And then 21.3% chose a British style dumpling there, option 5. So as we see, the 2 clearest most popular East Asian kinds of dumplings, a Chinese and a Japanese, the 2 generally most popular East Asian cuisines in Europe and America, have been picked as options 1 and 2. So again, we see more evidence that this is how we think of the word dumpling now. So just as a summary on dumplings, this is an example of a word that was born and bred in English, has then been adapted its use. So today I will talk about adopted words and adapted words. This is an adapted word, an English language word that we've used with a similar meaning that has now come to refer to things from other cultures primarily. I will also look at adopted words, sorry, even I'm getting confused. An adopted word in the next slide here, I'm going to be talking about curry, which is an adopted word, which originates in another language and is used to mean something that's a new import to a culture. So now we're going to look at curry as our next example. I apologize for flying through these, but I want to make sure there's time for everyone to talk. So what is curry? We also looked at. So the only definition of curry, a preparation of meat, fish, fruit or vegetables cooked with a quantity of brewed spices and turmeric and used as a relish or flavouring, especially for dishes composed of or served with rice. Now this dates back to 1598, so that's been part of the English language for a very long time and is part of a history of Britain in the British Raj and in India. So the dictionary terms listed as being of Tamil or Kannada origin, where curry or karil, I apologise, I cannot pronounce those words properly, are terms for a sauce or relish for rice. Now this original use of curry is very interesting and how it got brought into English. We also see compound terms of curry sauce, curry paste and curry powder that all appear in the OED as of 1845, 55 and 1810 respectively. Now these came into the English language through their popular use in cookery books in the 19th century. Now this is interesting because it really shows us how curry by this stage had become a very popular and very comfortable dish in the United Kingdom because it was being made at home. Once something is made at home, you know that it is people are comfortable with it, people eat it as part of their, mums will make it as part of their weekly routine, and that's how we know it had really been established. Now the use of the word curry in English is important to look at because it's come to mean almost any sauce-based and spiced dish. So it's not used to describe any particular flavour beyond the generic spices of the Indian, and as we'll look at afterwards, South Asian in general subcontinents. Whilst curry in its original meaning is roughly equivalent to gravy in English, so rarely used for specific dishes. So in English, you might see on a menu a chicken curry, whereas Indian, it will be described as, it will be a masala, or it'll have it describe the specific kind of spices. So its adoption is used as a catch-all term in English, really making something generic. It's almost a shame for the original use of the language. And we see this a lot also with the term dumpling, how all these different kinds of items are just brought in under one word. And that's a trend we see with food words in particular. Even as something becomes very common, we tend not to distinguish and we use it just as a catch-all term. So the next stage is to think, is the word curry still just Indian? So the adaptation of the term curry into the English language and the accompanying fondness for Indian cuisine shows that this homogenized term really becomes part of the English language. But it's commonly used to refer to other culinary cultures now, not just Indian. So as we see in our survey response on the left here, 95%, so taking out a margin of error, pretty much all of our respondees chose Indian as an option for where curry is from. But you have nearly 50% also picking Thai, and then Malaysian, and then Japanese, before selecting English as where the term curry belongs. We asked them about the word, not the dish. So really we're seeing that people are broadening it out to all different kinds of cuisines. This is a good kind of result of our increased globalized tastes and the influence on our cuisine. But B, it can be a generalizing, like I said before, a force to generalize, a force to almost take away distinct natures of culinary heritages and cuisines. Now, whether we think that's a good thing or a bad thing is up for debate again. Whether we think it's good that we're having these cuisines and we can talk about them and that in and of itself is a positive influence, or whether we think that the generalization is taking away the particularities of different cuisines, maybe we can think of that as a bad thing. The very interesting case I'd like to talk about in curry is cat's curry. So most of us will have heard of a cat's curry. It's a Japanese breaded cutlet, often pork, with a curry sauce on top, served with rice. Now, curry was introduced to Japan by British forces during the Meiji era. So boxed curry powder became popular amongst British troops as a result of the British Raj in India, and it was spread to Japan via the British Navy and military. Therefore, the word travelled from a Tamil or a Kannada origin to British soldiers and then back into Japan as curry. The katsu element as well has got a very international history. Katsu, the word, is short for katsuretsu in Japanese, a translation of the English word cutlet, which itself is bred from the French côtelette, as a lot of food words are in English, they come from French. So this describes the meat within the katsu curry. So this word, this phrase is all over the place. You've got the curry that comes from the east to the west, back to the east, and then you now have katsu curry becoming popular again in America and Europe as a dish in Japanese restaurants all over, restaurants on the street, you go to a branch of wasabi or itsu, you get a katsu curry. There you have a real boomerang term that's gone back and forth. And we like to talk about those. Those are very interesting. So again, we look at these terms are so globalized, there's no point trying to think of who they could belong to. I'm going to start rushing now. So I'm running out of time again. What are noodles? So the global history of noodles, I'm not going to run you through that because you can all read. Noodles are super interesting. There's a million different bits of history relating to them. We've got Chinese noodles popping up earliest because often in history we find that the Chinese have written a record of it before anyone else can get to it, such as life. We have Arab travelers on the Silk Road. We've got Japanese udon. We've got pasta coming up 13th or 14th century, but we think it's probably earlier than that. We've got Korean naengmyeon. We have ramen becoming popular in Japan only in the 1900s as an adaptation of a Chinese ramyeon. So we see this development of noodles really making it complicated to see where it's from. The English definition of it, again written there, comes from an 18th century German term, noodle. So again, now we think of the word noodle possibly as being an East Asian and Asian item. It comes from a German word in the English. So this is another example, like dumpling, that's been adapted and is really come to sort of refer to all kinds of foods, but again, generally in an East Asian context. Now, we do see some English speakers using the word noodle to refer to Italian pasta, more common in Australian and US English, but this is less common than using it to refer to East Asian food. So we see that our longer history with Italian and English means that pasta tend to have their own specific words, whereas noodles tend to just be homogenized. I'm going to skip past this bit and I'm going to let Jieun talk about ramdon briefly.
Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, I think many of you have watched this film, Parasite, which became a big hit this year. One of the dish that this sort of mysterious dish that cooked by Mrs. Kim to Miss Park was called in Korean they they said japaguri, but in English subtitle it says ramdon. And as Korean, we were like really wondering what ramdon is. But when you talk about japaguri first, that ja actually means from japaguri word itself shows really the extreme hybridity in Korean culinary terms. So ja means jjajangmyeon, which is like Korean style Chinese noodle, black bean noodle. So ja is sort of Sino-Korean origin. And spaghetti, you may kind of able to guess that spaghetti is Korean way of blending cut from spaghetti. So japaghetti means in Korean is Chinese style spaghetti. That is the ramen, which is instant noodle. But japaguri basically means japa is from again like japaghetti, that the black bean noodle, spaghetti type, and guri in Korea means raccoon. So very another very popular ramen, but they kind of cut this bit of two words, two ramen, and made up new word japaguri. And Dasi Park, the translator of this film, came up with this ramdon because he thought that Korean culinary terms, Korean food is not so familiar to Western audience. So he said, let me think about a new word. And what he came up with ramen plus udon, which is two types of Japanese noodle, and he kind of made up this new word, ramdon. And thinking that this is more accessible. But then people really, after the film becoming so popular, people sort of put their recipe in how to make ramdon or japaguri in their social media and became such a hit. And it's really interesting case because there was no such a thing, no word ramdon or japaguri in Korean, but somehow this film brought a new word and new culinary term, which becomes so popular and real. So now you can find recipe, celebrity chef's recipe or ramdon or japaguri in social media very easily. Can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, Niamh.
Muted again. Our last case study is on tea, as Laurence suggested at the start. So tea has a very complex etymology. Tea in English is thought to have been born from a Malay term brought back from Bantam by the Dutch. or an alternative word in the Amoy or Fujian dialects spoken in what's now modern day Taiwan, pronounced te. Again, I can't really say it. Tea in the English language is also accompanied by a parallel term cha, which originates from the same character, but pronounced in its Mandarin and Cantonese as cha. So, and this is thought to most likely traveled from Macau via Portuguese colonies. And cognates of these two words exist in a number of languages across Europe and the Middle East, including Spanish, French, Italian, Dutch, Portuguese, Arabic, and Turkish. So these cognates for either tea and cha exist in so many languages. So we see that this word really exploded from a Chinese, like a Sinospheric language origin. Our survey results for asking people which language or cultures do you most associate with the word tea are interesting, because we have 78.5% English and then 57.6% Chinese, followed by Japanese, Pan-Asian, and then Korean and Indian equally. So we see that people do now think of tea as being an English item and as an English word, but do recognize the Chinese origins of the term and the fact that in East Asia, tea is a very popular drink. So our two very interesting case studies here are chai latte and matcha latte, which I'm going to rush through as I have with everything. Chai latte is currently a draft addition to the OED, and it's dated to an origin in 1994 of a hot drink similar to masala chai made with spiced tea and steamed milk. Matcha latte does not yet appear in the OED, but matcha entered in 1881, so a very long time ago. So these two terms both demonstrate a very strong adapted use of words into hybrid terms. So chai latte, we have chai, which is of Chinese origin, but then taken from a masala chai context, so then an Indian cultural influence, but through a British adaptation of the word into English, and then latte, which is Italian, for the cafe latte, brought into US English, that again adapted from a sort of Seattle, West Coast US coffee culture to make chai latte. So you've got Chinese, you've got Indian cultural influence, you've got English, you've got Italian, you've got both British and US English in there. Matcha latte, similarly, we've got matcha, obviously a Japanese word referring to green tea powder, but then that became popular in desserts generally first on a sort of, when it first became kind of cool, social media, popular kind of coffee shop culture, was Southeast Asia. Hong Kong and Singapore are the first areas we see it become popular as an online term, at least. So therefore that's Japanese via Southeast Asian into English, and then we have the Italian and US English on the latte term. So these are some really interesting mixes of cultures and languages in the East, and then also different kinds of English. We have US English, we have British English, we have Southeast Asian English, Singaporean English, and Hong Kong English. So these are some really interesting ideas of where these words come from. Again, we see people recognizing, much like tea, the mixed heritage of these words. So chai latte primarily was thought of as an Indian word in our research, followed by English and then Chinese and Italian influence. Equally, matcha latte was primarily Japanese, then with Italian and English afterwards. So people are really recognizing these words as of multiple origins. And then, I might skip through milk tea, I'm afraid, but if anyone has any questions on milk tea, I can answer it. So I'm going to pass on to Jieun now.
Yeah, we would love to talk more, and we have so many food words that we like to talk, but I'm afraid we have this sort of time limit. So I'll talk a little bit about language motivation. Basically how the cultural engagement or cultural motivation matters in learning language, which I think we all share. Niamh, could we go to the next slide, please? So basically, I think if you're all living in Britain, you would have experienced that sort of despair, like how young people, young children actually dropping, their foreign language studies, then they don't really learn any foreign language, because believing that English may be enough. But it is really sad, and it is also, according to the British Academy report in 2015, the reason why they don't like language learning is because it's a bit boring, it's difficult to engage, and if they feel like it's disconnected with real life. So in a way, it's not like they just simply don't like language, but what we found is that they're really lack of cultural engagement. If we somehow give them something interesting that they can culturally engage with, then we believe that they will also learn language, and it will boost up their language learning as well as learning the other culture, and it has very good effect. And also we see something that we may all agree that this lack of language ability is economically also such a making us a big loss. Like it says the younger generations are missing out on possible socio-economic and cross-cultural benefits such as intellectual growth, understanding of other cultures, and broadened view of world. So it's really important. I think we all agree, those who come here, that it's important to learn others' language. There's so much benefit in it. Can you go to the next slide, please? Next slide, please. Okay. So yeah, this. But when you look at the Britain, as we talk about food, curry and noodle, dumpling, and everything. So much we are living in diversity. Like what we eat, who we are, it kind of really shows how diverse we are. And you know why it's very difficult to define even a very simple food word or ourselves as kind of really, this is English and this is Indian or this is Japanese, because of very much hybrid, complex nature and complex kind of pathway we all experience. So we kind of talks about linguistic diversity in the UK, basically how we are diverse. But at the same time, what is quite interesting is that when you talk about multilingualism or other language and culture, very often in foreign language education setting, it has emphasized on Western European languages like French, Spanish, and so on, German, and so on. Whereas actually in terms of our population, we, like Asian British or, very much, as you can see, has great population. And also just thinking about the food we eat, also how we, day-to-day basis enjoy Asian food. But what we try to say is that in terms of representation, probably less represented compared to the Western European language and cuisine and culture. Next slide, please. And yeah, so this is kind of what I did with some of my colleagues, basically teaching language through cooking, the cultural engagement, and the result I did with some adults, some university students, but also I did with young children. Next slide, please. Next slide, and next slide, please. So yeah, this is very simple. I've taught English language to young children. As you can see, there's two groups. One children are able to engage with cooking, cultural engagement, and they learn English language. Other groups, they only look at, without actual engagement, they only looked at photo and learned about the food and language. But when after the two groups, after 2 weeks learning experience, we kind of measured we interviewed them. Also, we kind of we wanted to find out how good they were. The result was that the group who actually were engaged with culture, cooking, basically, they really enjoyed. As you can see, I love learning language. That's what they said. Also, their result was very much better than the other group. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. So conclusion, we don't have enough time, but really the conclusion is that culture engagement, particularly cooking, because food is something that we are engaged everyday life. It helps us to understand others better, and also it kind of helps us to learn language and gives us motivation to learn language. So and we preparing a book. Can you go to the next slide, please? So this is our book that we are working on, and we have today only few food, but this book has full range of food, and also not just Asian food, but other places too. So yeah, who invented dumpling? So it does have a lot of stories about the culture and language and interaction, cultural exchange, and so on. Thank you so much, and a few questions maybe. Niamh, would you mind you pick up some questions from?
Yeah, sure. There are a few questions about the book. The title of it we've just gone over. When will it be published? We're not entirely sure yet. We don't have a publication date. We're hoping in the next sort of year or so it will be going through, but I'm sure be looking out for it. have a look around the Oxford websites. It will be kind of there.
Yeah, we also we've done a few podcasts as well, but we are trying to kind of launch our podcast next month, so you can kind of listen to our podcast, and the book. Yeah, we will also let you know when it's ready.
Mm-hmm. Do you bring food to your classes every week? Somebody asked at the top of the.
No, I mean, like, not quite, but yeah, I've done a few sort of public engagement events in museum and so on, like making sort of Korean kimbap and teaching them how to speak Korean. But it's really interesting. I think we all agree, and you all agree, that when you start talking about food, that there's no boundary. You can become friends very easily, and you can talk, and there's really a lot of things to talk about. And in this way, you can actually pick up the words, language, and then you have more interest too. And it's kind of nice when you go to the restaurant and they're able to understand what is actually ordering. So yeah, I think maybe two more questions, and I want to answer if you both can answer.
Let's have a look. We had some questions about the survey. So the age range of the dumpling survey, this is a very interesting question because it does make a difference. When we were looking at those dumpling responses that most people were saying Chinese, it did generally correlate that the number of people responding with East Asian answers did go along with, well, most people responded with an East Asian answer. I should probably say that the number of people responding with the British kind of dumplings did generally correlate with the number of over 50s or over 60s in the response. So it was, as an online survey tends to be, it was mostly in the ages 10 to 35, but over 50s and 60s did tend to respond to more traditionally, English language or British responses. So if that's what you're asking about, that's the answer there. I'm trying to think. Surely there are more speakers of Welsh. Someone's saying yes. Welsh and Polish are actually the next top two. So we've got Welsh and Polish, which are then followed by Urdu, Bengali, Gujarati, and then Arabic as well. So yes, Welsh is a very popular language in it.
And actually, Welsh and Polish food will also be figuring quite prominently in our book, I think.
Yes, definitely. We focused on East Asian foods today because we wanted to talk about Asian language heritage, and that's what we specialize in, but the book does have all kinds. What is the name of our podcast? The podcast is named Delicious Words.
Yeah, I have a book and another publisher called Delicious Words. So if you are interested, you can read a book that's called Delicious Words, and our podcast is also called Delicious Words. So words that make you really enjoy, and
Trying to see more questions. Where can we find more resources on teaching via food and cooking?
Teaching.
Jieun, that would be for you.
I
any more resources on teaching via food and cooking?
That is what we were so trying to promote, but not much yet. Yes, I mean there's the one the project I know about, Digital Kitchen Project, teaching French through Digital Kitchen, but it's a little bit different from what maybe real cultural engagement. But I think this is something, the method that has to be developed more. I would say, but also in order to teach language through teaching, you have to have a good kitchen in the school, so that's not really straightforward. But I think anybody who taught language through cooking, they would have really had this amazing experience, how they are engaging and how they want to learn more, both. And it's kind of doing one effort, and you learn how to cook, but also you learn how to speak languages. And there's so many language in terms of vocabulary and pragmatics and everything you can learn from simple action of cooking together. And and also it sort of makes the gap between the intergeneration, or all the gaps or barriers that you have between two people or many people, it disappears. And it's a very good way of bonding and being friends, and very naturally learning language. That's what we believe.
A very quick one there. Does Indonesian tempeh feature in our book? We do, it does. We have a section that will be on, we have a sort of soya-based section. So we have tofu, tempeh, soy sauces, but we also have it's going to be entitled kind of healthy eating. I know tempeh is its own cultural background and histories, but we are looking at the adaptation of certain ingredients completely removed out of their cultural settings and put into a kind of healthy eating, the way tofu and tempeh and seitan are used in generally Western European and US English context. So we talk about a mixture of their original heritages and their adaptation into Western food. And I think that's us pretty much out of time. We do have an interesting question about cooking verbs, someone asked they would like to know about verbs, cooking verbs in English. In French, we have verbs according to the amount of love and time put into a dish. And do we have an equivalent in other languages? That's an interesting question. Laurence, can have a brief idea on that.
Yes, well, I think that our book is covering a lot of different languages, and we can't necessarily go into enough detail on all of them, as much detail as we would like. But yeah, I mean, certainly, I think languages tend to have quite complex and interesting vocabulary dedicated to food and cooking, which includes verbs about how to cook things and the kind of method of cooking and the duration and so on. Yeah, it's a very interesting and varied topic.
And I think because of time, I think wonder if you can put our social media address in the chat box that people can.
Yes.
So you please leave a question into our social media. Our Twitter, that we will get back to you, and we'll also give you we'll post to news about podcast as well as the book, which we are so enjoying, I think, because we all love food and language. So yeah, we'll put this podcast and the information about book, and also I'll also put my book on Delicious Words, which is a small book about more like Asian food related English words, but we'll put all the information in the social media website. So do please leave comments and we'll get back to you. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Hope you have a good lunch if you haven't had yet. Great. Thank you so much. I think
You're welcome.
Yeah. Goodbye. Hi. Hi.
Hi there.
Hi.
Is it possible for us to continue to use the chat and the Q&A feature now?
Chat box, do you think we can copy the chat or not? I don't know. I never had done this before. Do you know how to do that? This is some interesting. Just copy and paste, maybe. Are we? Do we stop recording, or what do we do? Wow, so many chat comments.
I think we are still actually live.
Okay.
Suppose we end the meeting. Yeah.
Guys, if you're ready to end the meeting, please do, and I'll close it up for you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.